Hey everyone, Jarrett Fuller here, and this is Scratching the Surface. This is a bittersweet episode. This is not the introduction that I had originally recorded, and it's definitely not the introduction that I wanted. The truly incomparable Harry Cobb passed away yesterday at 93, and this week's episode is a conversation that I had with him at the end of 2019. Henry, for those of you who don't know, was a founding partner of Pei Cobb Freed Partners, the international architecture firm co-founded by I.M. Pei in 1955. He was the chair of the architecture program at the Harvard Graduate School of Design from 1980 to 1985, and in 2018 he published his first book, Words and Works, 1948 to 2018, that sort of used his career to trace what he calls the predicament of architecture. I had read the book last year and was just completely blown away by it, both the form and structure of it, but also the content. Here was a book that felt like a monograph, but wasn't a monograph. It felt like theory, but wasn't written like theory. And so I wrote a review of it for Design Observer, and shortly after it was published, I got an email from an architect who used to work for Cobb asking if I'd be interested in an introduction and if I was interested in having him on the show. And I obviously could not say no to that. So late last year, right before Thanksgiving, I visited Harry in his home one evening where we spoke for a long time about his career and about this book, about his time as chair of the architecture department at Harvard, and about the state of architecture today. Since hearing that he had died late last night, I find myself thinking about the end of this conversation. I wanted to know what it was about architecture that kept his interest for 70 years. We talked about what he was working on, a new building he had hoped to see finished in his lifetime, and a new book that he was currently writing, and other projects he was thinking about. And here was someone who, even after a 7-decade career, was still asking questions, was still thinking, was still interested. If I'm lucky to live to 90, I hope that I feel the same way. In a way, I guess that's what Scratching the Surface has always been about. He was incredibly generous and answered all of my questions thoughtfully. And when we stopped recording, he turned the conversation back to me and asked about what I was interested in and what I was working on. And from what I've seen, this is how he was with everyone. Here is someone who had this outsized influence on architecture, but did so with humility, with generosity, with grace. And in my experience, that's a rare combination. So this episode is for Harry. It is a thank you for his work, for his writing, for sharing, for teaching, for giving, and for this conversation. It meant a lot to me, and it means even more to me now. And I hope that this is a fitting tribute and perhaps another small way to remember him. So here is me and Henry Cobb. I'd like to start actually by talking about the book a little bit and a little bit about how the book came together, because I think there's something striking in the format of the book itself. The fact that it's a very small book, the fact that it kind of mixes text and image and gives those equal weight, and that in thinking about your entire career, it isn't just looking at your built work, but is also looking at your writing, your thinking, your teaching, and it handles all of those equally. It doesn't necessarily give kind of prominence to one over the other. And I'm curious about why you wanted to do that and how you were thinking about this book as you were putting it together.
The book only took 20 years. And never would have happened if Emma had not only prodded me, but done most of the hard work that has to be done, especially when you have a book full of pictures, which is, but let me just start by saying I've received very gratifying positive responses to the book, and almost everyone who writes to me starts by commenting on the format.
Yeah.
Which I'm very pleased to hear, because the one thing that I felt strongly about is that I want people to understand that this is a book. It's not a monograph, it's a book. People still call it a monograph, but which I don't like, but nonetheless.
I think I called it a monograph when I wrote about it.
It's a book because a monograph doesn't have this kind of mix in it. So the format, to start with something that may be trivial, and you may have read about it if you read the acknowledgments, but the format of this book is owing to my love affair with the books of Edmund Wilson. Books of Edmund Wilson are all in that format, and they are unique.
Right.
No one else has ever used that format.
Right.
And I've always been in love with it for precisely the reason, the way it lies in the hand. So when I went to Gianfranco Monticelli to reopen the question, I had a contract with him which expired many years ago because I didn't produce. So he was kind enough to reopen the conversation. And I took this book with me and I said, this is what I want. And he was skeptical, the way anyone would, when you think of a book that's full of images being this size. But he agreed to it. He did say he held on to it for a while and thought about it while we were talking about other things, and then all of a sudden he interrupted the conversation to say, $45, that's all I can charge. So the result of that is that we do not have a dust jacket. We do not have a cloth cover. We have this rather cheesy thing, which, if you have the book, do you have the book?
Yeah, I have my copy right here too.
Some people say they like the fact that it wears, but it's not. I would have liked to have a cloth binding, and I would like to have had a dust jacket. But there was a negotiation about how many pages I could have and what it would be about. And for me, it was more important to have the format and to have the number of pages, which I would have liked to have a few more pages. If there's a second edition, I will try to add a few pages, because it only contains about less than half of my work, actually. So there are a couple of things that got left out, more than a couple. But I don't particularly want to load it up with my work either. They're just, because the whole thing, as you noted in your review, is the balance between text and projects. And the text, by and large, in fact, all of the texts expand the frame of reference beyond particular projects. Sometimes the texts deal with a building type. Sometimes they deal with conversations. Sometimes they're lectures that I gave, and as you know, it's arranged quite rigorously, chronologically, and there's a very specific reason for that, which is that I think for the book to be useful to young people, and that's what really interests me. I mean, I imagine students today and students 20 years from now or whatever, who may be interested in what I call the predicament of architecture during the time frame of my practice, that this book is a useful source.
Right.
It's useful because it's not really, it is definitively not a monograph. The projects that are illustrated in it and described are never fully described. They're only in it because some larger set of issues that I want to talk about. So you won't find a single project in the book comprehensively presented.
Right.
And nobody has complained about that, which makes me, that doesn't mean that, I mean, nobody has actually complained about that. And so I think they get it.
Yeah.
And as you point out, it's a book to be read. I really wanted to have it read. Although it was not my idea that it had to be read cover to cover, but rather that you would be able to dip into it.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people have done that, but on the other hand, some people have read it cover to cover, and it's very gratifying to me that they report that it really reads cover to cover.
Yeah.
Because they tell me, which is, I won't say that it wasn't on purpose, but I will say that it's a little bit a happy accident. It comes out of the chronological arrangement that one chapter sort of opens up the next chapter, opens up the next chapter.
Mm-hmm.
So people find that they want to read it from the beginning, which is very gratifying.
Well, what I think is interesting about that, and I did read it cover to cover, but I agree with you. I don't think that you need to. But what was striking to me is how there are themes that it seems like you return to again and again in your work and in your writing and in your thinking. And I think things about kind of the ethics of architecture and what is the building supposed to do for the people who inhabit it. You return again and again to questions around placemaking and how a building is situated within a particular environment. And all of that is set up in that first project, which I guess was your kind of thesis project, and that you were asking those questions there. And I was curious, was part of putting this book together and was selecting these and it only being kind of half of your work, was it some way to kind of organize this, this kind of life's work, these kind of questions that you were returning to again and again to, kind of make sense of them in some way?
Everyone wants to leave something behind, and that's inevitable. You want, and the only thing I knew is that I didn't want it to be a monograph.
Mm-hmm. Why not? Why are you so adamant about it?
For a very simple reason that monographs describe projects. Graphically and textually, they describe projects. They're very boring.
Yeah.
They're very hard to deal with. They're generally bulky. I hate, for example, I particularly hate the glossy paper that's used in monographs.
Yeah.
And I insisted that I wouldn't have that, even though I realized that the quality of the images may be marginally degraded, but it doesn't matter because I'm not that interested. I mean, I want the pictures to be attractive, but I'm not that interested in that aspect of it. So what interests me, and I say it very explicitly in the afterword, is to give some insight into the predicament of architecture, which is what I call during my 7 decades of practice, which happened to have been 7 decades in which a remarkable series of events happened in architecture. The triumph of modernism, the decay of modernism, urban renewal, which we were involved in, the catastrophe of urban renewal, the postmodern movement and its very rapid collapse, and what's happened since then, and the current predicament of the digital revolution, which, my thought about it is that what Mario Cappo calls the digital turn has both energized and innervated architecture.
Mm-hmm.
Energized by the scope of its potential and innervated by the scope of its potential.
Right.
And that worries me somewhat. So one way out of that predicament is to explain in a way that a student, for example, can understand how architecture happens and what are the issues that the architect has to contend with and why and how do they change over time. And to give a sense of, first of all, that, in my opinion, any reasonably intelligent person, modestly gifted but not a genius, any reasonably intelligent person can make architecture. But in order to do so, you have to have an intention, a set of intentions, which you develop over time, starting at the beginning of your life. That's why this book begins with these funny pages. I'll come back to that in a moment. And that intentionality, my friend Peter Osmond calls it a project. I'm not as specific as he is a project, but intentionality is sense of what are the values that underlie your work, what are you trying to do, how do you need to connect to people. There's a lot in here about the problem of the evolution of the client constituency over this period, which is really remarkable. And it's greatly complicated architecture because it's no longer what it was assumed to be even as recently as 50 years ago, which is that there's an institution that needs something and they go to choose an architect and the architect produces a project for a site and that's that. But today we know that that's not the way it should happen. And the fact that architects allowed that to happen is responsible for a lot of terrible things. For example, if you start with the universities, the expansion of universities, starting at the end of World War II with the return of people from the war, that expansion, which still goes on, transformed universities in a very significant way, which I do discuss. It required buildings of a scale that tended to challenge one of the underlying ideas of American universities, which is buildings framing an open space or a series of open spaces, the Harvard Yard being the greatest example of all, but then I have to say something good about Harvard. But Harvard is also an example of how that strategy didn't hold up because the university, it did hold up in this sense that at least they protected the yard. Many universities didn't protect the equivalent of their yards. And the result is that the campuses that used to be space positive became building positive.
Right.
And spaces became residual rather than organizing. So there's that problem. The second problem is that the scale of buildings invited and sometimes required changes in material and detail and structure from the traditions of the American campus. So And that was sometimes alarming or difficult to deal with because universities value their traditions and they think of their campus as preserving it, emblematic of a tradition. So, and I've had to deal with that often. So that's a major second problem. And the third problem is that universities grew, and in growing, they impinged on their surrounding communities and met a lot of resistance. To give you a sample of that, the 2 buildings that I did at Harvard finished 2005, called the Center for Government and National Studies on Cambridge Street. Are you familiar?
Yeah, I mean a little bit, but I know what building you're talking about. Yeah.
Well, it took me 4 full years to get that building through the process of Cambridge approval because there was so much negative publicity about religion. You know, it occurred at a very sensitive spot, which is probably why I was selected, because they knew they were giving me a very hot potato. But it's right at the edge of a residential neighborhood, and it also involves an open space. Do you know Gun Hall well?
Very little, yeah.
Well, there's a space between Gun Hall and the residential buildings on the other side of the block, and that space is one of the very few open spaces at Harvard which are shared by the community and by university. So that's great. And unfortunately, before I was hired, they had been through a study which resulted in a proposal that would eliminate that open space. So that, for example, when I went to Cambridge for my first meeting, I think Laurie Owen went with me because we all knew that landscape was an important issue. The neighbors turned out in force with placards saying "Stop."
Right.
The building was called then Knaffle, Stop Knaffle, and they even had their dogs with "Stop Knaffle" around their neck. It was, and it was a very interesting experience. However, in that 4 years, see, a lot of people assume that if you have that kind of a problem, it's bad for architecture, because architecture is going to suffer from this. And I say, you should never assume that. You should always assume that this is part of the task of the architect to extract from seemingly impossible situations with seemingly hostile forces, to extract from it a positive outcome.
Right.
That's why I say, if the outcome isn't good, you should blame the architect, because the architect cannot get off by saying, well, I had a terrible client or this or that.
Right.
So part of in the case of the Harvard buildings, the result of multiple redesigns is that the buildings got better, not worse.
Right, exactly.
Why did they get better? Because I was very conscious of the opportunities that were opening up for me from the opposition to the design. And I could see how I could respond to those concerns and at the same time make, from my point of view, a better building. So those 4 years were not wasted. They were, and so again, the book, because of its brevity, it doesn't go into a lot of detail about things like that, although it does happen to mention that it took 4 years. But so something that comes through in the book, I think, because friends of mine who are architects, and by the way, especially young architects, most of the people who write to me are young architects. So by young, I mean under 50. But they respond to the fact that, to the insights in what are the issues in architecture and how do you deal with them. And so the goal of this book is to give people, especially young people, a sense of what it is to be an architect in a particular period, which even though it isn't their period, they can understand what's going on and be interested in what's going on, even though for them it's ancient history. But still it's interesting history.
Yeah.
Because it happens to be, again, the triumph of modernism, the decay of modernism, the onset of postmodernism, the decay of postmodernism, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an interesting period.
Well, can I ask you another question kind of about that a little bit? And I think this kind of, something that you mentioned earlier is that a lot of the writing in the book does kind of widen the frame a little bit. And it doesn't just focus on the work itself, but kind of starting to put that into this context that you're talking about. And I'm kind of, and this writing was happening throughout this work also. This isn't,
Yes.
A lot of this writing wasn't done in the process of the book.
That's very, very important, because I want people to understand how one's thinking evolves. So I wanted those early lectures to reflect my state of mind at that moment. That's why the lecture on building in cities occurred right after, as Hancock was being finished. And then the lecture called American Architecture, 1958 to 83, occurred at a particular moment. And I wanted to characterize that moment. And then my inaugural lecture at Harvard was kind of what I said it was, where I stand. And then the lecture after which I devoted more effort than any other is the architecture of the university, which was a very influential lecture at the time. It was actually, well, you wouldn't remember that time, but there was a time in the 80s when some number of schools of architecture were under attack. First of all, as you know, may not know, but you should know, that in the revolution of the late 60s and early 70s, architecture was one of the principal victims, and schools of architecture were principal victims, because architecture, because of the way it operates in the world, because of its, some would say, contamination by so many issues, social, political, financial, and so when you have a kind of revolution, as the 68, 69 was, architecture tends to get wiped out. Actually, I would say that architecture has never fully recovered as a discipline from that, in the sense that it's very hard to get people interested in architecture as a discipline, architecture as an art. Everybody has their agenda, be it environmental, social, whatever, and those agendas are important, and architecture has to deal with them. That's a point I make throughout the book. But the problem is that those issues do not make an architecture. What I want people to understand is that while it's always wonderful to have a few geniuses, a few transcendent people, the world cannot be made on their work. The work is going to be made on people much like myself, who are moderately intelligent, moderately gifted, but nothing special. So how do you make meaningful architecture when you're under all these pressures? And maintain that you do it by facing that predicament and understanding how to make something positive out of all the negative things that you have to face. That to me is the most important lesson. I used to tell students that you really have to recognize that all the bad things that happen have hidden in them some potential, if you can recognize it, to make something better. And therefore you cannot get caught up in the frenzy of moral, fist shaking and so on that happens because, you do have to respond to it. You have to respond. Let's take right away the environmental issues. They're really important, and they are going to reshape architecture, but they're not architecture. They are conditions that need to operate, but they don't get you over the finish line.
Right. Yeah.
In
Yeah.
and of themselves, nothing does. That's what architecture is about. And also, I want people to understand that you can actually get an enormous amount of satisfaction out of being an architect if you can figure out how to deal with that predicament.
Right.
That you're always facing hostile forces. You're always facing difficult problems, which basically hostile to your design intent or seen that way.
Right.
And if you allow that to defeat you, then, and unfortunately, mostly that's what happens.
Yeah.
So you end up with mediocrity, with mediocre compromise solutions. It's terrible. It's terrible. It's what we see in housing. It's what we see often in universities. It's what we see even in public buildings. Every building today, is subject to so many pressures, so many people who want to be heard, and so the art of architecture is the art of knowing how to deal with that and make something positive out of it. So that brings me to something totally irrelevant, but I want to talk about it.
Okay.
One of my favorite books is Borromini and the Roman Oratory by Joseph Connors. And the reason it's one of my favorite books is that it's one of the very few books in which you can find out, in which you get a sense precisely of what is the predicament of the architect. At that time, you can almost feel, in fact, the thing that really excited me about it is that as I read this book, I said, I really got a sense of what it was to face the issues that he was facing. For example, I don't know whether you know this building, but the people who commissioned this building were singers. That's what the oratory, they were oratory.
Okay.
And very few historians have that sense. That's why I admire this book so much, because you really get a sense of what the architect went through. These people had no interest in a fancy building at all.
Right.
In fact, they wanted a very plain building because they were singers and they weren't interested in architecture. Anything. So what did they got? They got one of the most elaborate facades in history. And how did it happen? It happened because Borromini, it's true that he did have a sponsor who helped him, but he basically found a way to tell them one thing and give them another.
Right.
And so the thing that's amazing about this is the author, Joe Connors, I don't know whether you know him.
The name sounds familiar, but...
He's the authority on Borromini.
Okay.
But he began life as a classicist. He only became an architectural historian. So later, well, not really late, but probably in his 30s. And yet he has this insight that very few historians have. And one of the reasons that architectural histories are often so boring is precisely because the historian doesn't get it, doesn't know why
Exactly.
That's what you might consider a trivial example of that, but I chose to put it in the book, is the story of Trinity Church.
Yeah.
Where people don't understand why Richardson won the competition. And they just don't understand because they don't think about the motivations of the client and how the architect was able to respond to those and get the job. Richardson, as you know, said there are 2 rules for practice of architecture. Rule 1, get the job. Rule 2, get the job. Rule 3, get the job.
Right.
So, but anyway, so that kind of, I like to sprinkle a few insights like that because I think you need to. I mean, there's so much. It's so difficult, truthfully, to extract, to make architecture out of the opportunities, the challenges that we face. And it's particularly difficult because there's still the residue of distrust, and not without justification, that people have, still remembering a modern architecture which in their view dumbed down the city. And it's true that it did dumb down the city. Because for every Seagram building, you have 10,000 mediocrities.
Right.
And people don't really understand that.
Right.
But they need to see that this is it's so difficult to communicate that to people. And and it's so, I mean, my life and what's in the book is sprinkled with fairly intractable problems. And I'm very much aware that there may be different opinions about the outcome, but I think you have to believe in something.
Yeah.
And people ask me how I gave a lecture a couple of weeks ago at Columbia in which I described the process of the Hancock Tower. And somebody wrote me an email asking me saying, how did you actually live through that? Because it's all more or less what's written. And the truth is, I don't say it in the book, but I'm actually doing an essay in which I will say it. I did it only because I was born and grew up in Boston.
Right.
I never would have presumed to do something as manifestly egregious in any other city, and I've built in cities around the world. And you're a guest, and as a guest, you have to respect certain norms.
That's interesting.
The thing about Boston was that despite the fierceness of the opposition and the unanimity of it, because everybody came out, all the deans of both architecture schools, all the architects in Boston, blue ribbon commissions, they all came out and said this building should not be built. And nonetheless, I got through that simply by the fact that I believed that I understood the problem better than they did.
Right.
And I think that I was proven correct because the building is, I think it was proven correct that what Copley Square needed was in fact a tower, a very special kind of tower, which has now, in conjunction with Trinity Church and the square, become quite memorable. The 3 work together, the square, the church, and the tower. And as a group, what's interesting about them is that it really is a marriage of memory and invention. It really is about resolving the predicament that grew out of a very specific topographical problem that Copley Square was built outside of the, next to, but outside of the well-organized blocks of the Back Bay. Do you know Boston well?
I've only been there a couple times.
Oh. Well, anyway, so Copley Square was exposed to, as I explained, to all these forces, and was kind of overwhelmed by them. And I said, first of all, I said, which is very, very important, that if you want to understand what to do, you have to place the problem in the stream of history.
Right.
You have to understand how it got into this impasse. So that's why understanding the history is crucial.
Yeah.
Having understood the history, it became clear to me that the only way to restore meaning in Copley Square, or in a way to invent a new meaning for Copley Square, was to give Copley Square its own tower, it could not stand aside from the new scale. It had to embrace the new scale, but in a very particular way. So, again, I'm hoping that the way I tell the story, I think it's engaging because people
it is.
But I'm hoping that people will learn from it, that because you really do have to know when to bend and when to stand your ground. And it's a Chinese proverb, I would say, I think, about that a strong person is like a grass that bends in the wind.
Oh, yeah.
In this particular case, of course, what made the story more problematic was the fact that there was a political solution which made people justifiably very angry. So we were really in the doghouse. But most projects, not as controversial as that, there are some presumptions that have to be challenged. Coming back to universities, for example, it's a notable example that is in the book, the Graduate School of Management at UCLA.
Oh, right.
That was, when it was built, the second largest building at UCLA. And all the buildings that had been built, UCLA was established in the 30s with the Italian Norman architecture of Royce Hall and the library. And after World War II, again, but particularly in the 60s and 70s, there was this explosion of big buildings, which totally, again, rendered what were supposed to be spaces, rendered them marginal, building huge, bulky buildings. So my main agenda in that project was to show that you can build a big building and still make it a building that shapes space.
Right.
And in this particular case, it not only shapes space, but it shapes a pathway from the lower campus to the upper campus and things. So, in that sense, things I put in the book, I put in for a particular reason or a particular point, and as you probably noticed, there's no detailed description of the building beyond the point that I want to make.
Right.
Because otherwise it would become huge and unmanageable, and it's not interesting, truthfully. I mean, yes, I'd like to, but in this context, you have to keep people engaged. So that's why I am always so pleased to learn that people read it occasionally cover to cover, because it means that they're engaged.
Yeah. I want to connect this a little bit to teaching, because I think, the way you talk about that book, which was exactly how I felt reading your book, and that I kind of felt like I understood your thought process, kind of what you were going through in the moment. And you're talking about this book as being a book that should be read, and you're imagining it for young architects, for students. You are a teacher, you were the chair at Harvard for a while. I'm curious, how teaching kind of influences your work, or what it is about teaching and kind of passing on these ideas that's so kind of important to you in the way that you think about all of this work.
Well, it's important, and it's not only important in the formal act of teaching at a university, it's important even in the way one conducts one's practice.
Right.
So, because, anyway, that's obvious, I think, but I've taught most of my life, but mostly as a studio critic until except for that 5 years at Harvard as chair. So I never, except for that engagement, I had no responsibility for education in the largest sense.
Right.
I was focused on studio teaching, and actually I did a lot of it, but I'm not sure that I was that good at it. But I mean, teaching is a matter of personality and enthusiasm and commitment, which you sense in a teacher. I would say that because, as you can tell, I gave not a lot, but occasional lectures all the way through my life. And occasional papers and things. And generally speaking, I was dealing with what engaged me at the moment. So the lecture on building in cities was the result of my first 2 decades of practice, which was entirely devoted to big development.
Right.
And architecture in the university was my assessment of the dilemma, the misfit status of architecture as a discipline, which, now I will say that issue finally has been addressed in a number of schools, because as you can tell, I was not a big fan of the program that I went through myself.
Yeah.
Because it was incredibly, should I say, impoverished intellectually and in every other way. Except what was great about it was the students and the enthusiasm and the fact that we were all determined to remake the world. So it really didn't matter that, for the most part, the teachers were not inspiring us, although a few did. But the loss of confidence in architecture and in architectural education that happened in the late 60s and 70s destroyed almost every school, or dumbed down almost every school. It took a good decade to recover. One of the rare exceptions to that was Cooper Union, because of John Haydock. Somehow he managed to keep architecture as a discipline alive, but in most schools, including notably Harvard, architecture as a discipline was simply, what am I going to say, squashed under this load of politico-social issues. In 1969, when the revolution at Harvard took place, I had the misfortune to be the president of the GSD alumni. And the school, well, you wouldn't know this, but in a way I should have put it in the book, but it would take another chapter. The school shut down completely. And the GSD was the epicenter, in the sense that if you wanted to get your red fist silk screened onto your T-shirt, you took it to the basement of Robinson Hall, and the red fist was designed by a student at Robinson Hall, and that's where you. So it was very emblematic. Which did not please the president at all, and he took his revenge in horrible ways. But anyway, during that period of spring, summer of '69, my task was to sort of organize meetings between faculty, student, alumni to try to get out of this impasse. And I documented 150 hours of meetings in about 6 months. And during those meetings, so far as I can recall, the word architecture was never used. It was all about governance and roles and responsibilities. And the students wanted to write a new constitution for the GSD. I mean, literally political constitution.
Oh, wow.
So you can see where it was going. Architecture was erased, and then the president was so unhappy about the GSD that he appointed a professor from the business school to be the new dean. And then ensued a decade of really sort of nothing. And that's why I say I was lucky, because when I went to be chair, there was nowhere to go but up.
Right.
In a certain sense, I was the beneficiary of that. And it permitted me to engage in my own strategy, which was, as you know, rather disruptive. And the vulnerability of architecture, both in education and in practice, to being suppressed as a discipline by all the ancillary disciplines that we have to deal with. That's a real problem. And that's why architecture was a misfit, because it didn't have a discipline that was recognized by the university of even being deserving. However, now at Harvard and elsewhere, there are a whole lot of programs that do link the school to other branches of the university, so that part has been strengthened. What is crucial, of course, is that you need to strengthen those outreaches, but you can't lose the core of the discipline, the understanding that none of these things in and of themselves make architecture. They're all essential ingredients that have to be responded to, but something else is needed, and that's what
I hope this isn't a weird way to ask this question, but I'm very interested in what you think it is about architecture that has kept you engaged with these questions for as long as you have. And that you are still, that this book is not the end, as you're kind of talking about, that you're still thinking about this stuff. What is it about this that you keep kind of having these questions?
I'd say it's that I'm not terribly gifted. If you're not terribly gifted, you have to find a way of engaging the world that's meaningful. So, and one of my purposes, which I was getting around to saying, of the book is to somehow show people, without actually saying it, that if you go about it the right way, you can contribute to the discipline without being a transcendent genius.
Right.
I mean, you still have to be in awe and respect and understand those very gifted, creative people. But the fact is that the world is not going to be built by those people. It's going to be built by less gifted people. And how can it be built by less gifted people without being a disaster? And that's where I think what I'm trying to communicate is that you have to engage these other issues and find out how to fold them in to the discipline of architecture. And of course, in the process, you have to learn how to deal with clients and how to persuade people and how to make, there's a whole lot of stuff. It's so messy, and it's so complex, the ways in which architecture engages the world, and many of those ways are so unfavorable to architecture to begin with that it's just a huge uphill battle. But it's very gratifying. I don't regret for one moment choosing this path, although I recognize, and I hope the book somehow allows you to see that there can be misapprehensions, there can be mistakes, there can be things that go wrong that don't destroy the possibility, but you have to recognize them.
Right.
And so, I mean, most notably in my generation, the erasure of history was a big problem. The result is that if you go downstairs, you'll find one of the larger architectural libraries in New York, because I sort of overcompensated.
Yeah.
But it, I was 40 before I really began to understand what how history could be useful to me. And problem with postmodernism is that it was the wrong way to make history useful, because that stylistic mimicry was just totally wrong.
Yeah.
And so, and one of the, I was very disturbed because Portland Museum is one of my favorite buildings, and I was very upset when it was published. I'm forgetting his name now, but an Italian architect who was a leader of postmodernism had a magazine, and he featured my museum as an example of postmodernism. And I was very upset by that. And I understand why Venturi was always very upset, because, if there's anyone who understood how to make history the source of invention, it was Venturi.
Yeah.
And I couldn't do that. Probably I couldn't have done it even if my life had been different, but having spent, having been introduced to architecture through a rather narrow modernist lens, and one of my weaknesses is that I don't have an ironical bone in my body, whereas Venturi is all about irony.
Right.
So I'm a little bit at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
I can't really deal with that, and I think being able to deal with irony is one of the most important talents that you could have. Very few people have it. I truthfully don't think of anyone outside Venturi who really is gifted in that way of making. So that's why in the chapter on the Sainsbury wing, I readily acknowledge that it would have, what I did was not ironical.
Right.
What he did was totally ironical.
Yeah.
And he deserved to win, probably, because irony was the right mode.
Yeah,
at that situation. Can I turn the conversation
Sure.
just for a minute, because
Yeah.
I just want to make clear. I just wanted to. This is a book that recently appeared called Designing in Garden by Michael van Valkenburg. Do you know him?
I know that name.
Anyway, this is, I think, the best book on landscape architecture that I've ever read. And it's devoted entirely to one project.
Oh,
And
interesting.
it has the same mix of text and images. And of course, it's the same publisher, except I'm angry because he got a cloth cover.
Yeah, I was gonna say no sleeve though.
Yeah, well, but then he got embossed. He got what I didn't get. But it's really, if you're in, and I know you are interested in books,
Yeah.
I think this is a particularly handsome book, and it's also very well written.
Yeah.
It's entirely about one small project.
That's interesting. I was gonna ask
But
you
it
about.
expands into, you get a sense.
Yeah.
In other words, unlike my book, which is kind of encyclopedic, this book,
That's
through the
interesting.
lens of a single project, gives you a sense of what it is to be a landscape architect. So it's quite amazing.
I was gonna ask you about books that have influenced you or influenced this book, and you've already given two.
This is brand new.
So yeah,
I
this
just got it.
retrospectively.
In terms of format, this was the model.
Yeah.
In terms of content, there is no model. Because, truthfully,
Right.
if you think about it, I mean, I have a number of architects' biographies or autobiographies. They're generally not interesting.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons they're not interesting is that the people who write them, well, even an architect writing an autobiography generally is doing a verbal monograph,
Right.
which is not interesting.
Right.
And somebody writing a biography of an architect is generally ticking off all the boxes,
Yeah.
getting through a career,
Yeah.
and so, you know, that's why I admire this book so much, because I don't know many books.
Yeah.
I know a lot of historians, some of whom I admire a lot, but I still don't feel that they grasp what it is to be an architect. That's very rare, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me ask you this as the kind of last question, which I think is actually a nice way to kind of wrap all of this up, because you mentioned very early on that you were kind of giving these lectures or writing these kind of essays because you wanted to kind of give insight into what you were thinking at the time. And you mentioned that you were writing some things now, and I'm kind of curious, what are the things that are exciting you right now? What are the things that you are thinking about now?
Well, I'm no longer really in practice. I have one project that just started construction, a museum in Charleston, which is in the book. It's very important to me. I hope I'll be around when it's finished, but otherwise, at this point, I'm actually thinking of writing another book. I'm not going to tell you about it, but it's not going to be anything like this.
Okay.
So you have to realize that, in effect, my career as an architect is essentially over. My life is, but that doesn't mean. But I can still keep writing.
Yeah, that's kind of why I was
And
curious.
what I'm trying to figure out, again, for me, it's all about, because I still think that it's not sufficiently understood about what are the sources of architecture. What is it that in one's own life that leads you to think about things in a certain way? You noticed, but you haven't commented on the first pages of this book.
Oh yeah,
It's an interesting story.
yeah. You said you were going to come back to this too.
So see, I wanted to have, to give people a sense of my life before I
Right.
started architecture. And originally I had a preface, illustrated preface. And my editors at Over Under, there are two people, Mark Pasnick, do you know him?
I know of them. I don't know them personally.
Chris Grimley's the designer. I chose them specifically because I wanted the design and the editing in one place.
Yeah.
I didn't want to have a designer over here and an editor.
Yeah.
It worked out quite well.
Yeah.
So, but what they said is, no, you must start the book with the chapter on your thesis.
Yeah.
There cannot be any preamble because it's very exciting the way it starts.
Yeah, it is.
And you plunge right into it. They said, and anything else I proposed, they rejected or they were very negative about. So finally, I said, well, what am I going to do? There are a few things their solution, which I think is quite successful, is that you can have a few pages without any explanation.
Yeah, and they just sit there.
Without any explanation. And of course, one of them is one that says why I shouldn't be an architect. The other one is about a very important trip that I made to Eastern Europe in 1947.
Mm-hmm.
And I returned from that trip determined to go back to Warsaw after I graduated because I was so excited about the replanning in Warsaw, the people I met there.
Yeah.
It was thrilling. And the recovery from the horrors that they'd been through. But by the time I graduated, the Cold War had set in, Stalin had stepped in. So anyway, 60 years later or so, there was occasion for the photographs that I took then, which had been in a box for 60 years. I had an occasion to show them to some people in Warsaw, and they were so stunned. They produced a major exhibition and a book. So that's my first book, actually.
Oh, wow.
Of my photographs of Warsaw in 1947. Do you think that worked, by the way? A lot of people find it amusing, but you haven't commented on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you said you were going to come back to it, so I thought I would let you come back to it. I thought, the Poland one, I did not. Now hearing that context makes more sense, but I got it as this kind of visual preface, kind of like you're saying. It's a way. It gives us this kind of sense of placement before we get into it.
If you read the text, which is difficult to read,
yeah,
you see that it reflects my enthusiasm for socialist planning.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was it was definitely the right decision to limit it, let those just sit there on their own, and then go right into your thesis. I thought was smart.
Did the right thing.
Yeah,
and it does make a big difference. So I think the conversations have quite a different feel to them from the lectures, and people seem to find that. Otherwise, if they were all lectures, I think it would be too much.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like what we were talking about at the beginning. I think that kind of the difference in tone, the move between conversation, between lectures, between essays, between remarks, between visuals are. I mean, not to kind of go all the way back to the way we started, but just as a way to kind of wrap up the conversation, it is a way to do exactly what I think you set out to do, which was kind of mark this moment in time, kind of taking your career and your work as a lens to ask these bigger questions. And that's kind of what I took away from it.
You got it right.
And I think it's a great book. And I think you're selling yourself a little short saying that you're not gifted, but this conversation was completely.
I didn't say I'm not gifted. I said I'm not extraordinarily
moderately gifted.
Yeah, anyway. Well,
yeah.
But if you're moderately gifted and you want to accomplish something significant, you have to marry it to a larger intention.
Yeah.
And that's what this book is about.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that you succeeded. This conversation was completely an honor for me. Thank you so much for doing this. I really enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it too.
This episode was recorded on November 20th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.